My name is Stefan D. Boating, and welcome to episode 24 of the Flow University YouTube channel, where we'll be talking about spiritual fitness. Originally, we were going to talk about business fitness, but in light of some of the protests going on around the country and some of the other chaotic events that are swirling around the world outside of the United States, I believe that this is the time for us as humans to begin to reawaken from the slumber that we have been cast into due to the lullaby of modern society. I hope you all enjoy this week's episode of the Flow University YouTube channel and use the keys to aid you in being able to battle some of the forces of darkness that wish to submit you to the forces of fear, despair, and decay. Let's get started. A sound soul dwells within a sound mind and a sound body. As we begin episode 24 of the Flow University YouTube channel, going into key number 1, consciousness. We as the human species have long debated and had philosophical times where we have tried to dive into the true mysteries of what consciousness is. And the true nature of consciousness isn't one that gives one an absolute definitive answer. Consciousness must be explored by the individual because consciousness can go infinitely, because there are infinite aspects and different perspectives from which one can view consciousness. And there are different levels and spheres and levels to consciousness. So in key number 1, you want to expand and zoom in your consciousness. You want to play with consciousness. Consciousness just not in the outer reality, but in the internal world as well as how conscious of you are past events or future visions. Consciousness isn't a singular dimensional aspect of reality. Consciousness is a multi-dimensional aspect of reality, just as you are as a multi-dimensional being having a human experience. So within this, begin to play with consciousness as you play within life. And with this, you will see a increase in your overall consciousness and your ability to interpret your own unique conscious perception of reality, and not just reality in the external field, but in the internal world as well. The main issue with humans in modern society, and the main reason why humans lack a high degree of spiritual fitness, is because most humans do not understand the uniqueness of themselves. And when you do not understand the uniqueness of yourself, it is hard for you to understand the uniqueness of others. And it is easier for you to conform to whatever the outer societal world has deemed as normal, even if the normal that society has imposed upon you is absurd. Namely, we'll use some of the events in the past. When certain settlers came to the New World in the past, they deemed some of the Native Americans as savages, but they deemed them as such based on their consciousness and their perception. And because they could not understand the uniqueness truly within themselves and then therefore see the uniqueness in others, they deemed them as something other than themselves. And then instead of them being one with themselves, and because of that, they sought to drive them out and destroy them, or submit them to their worldview. And so when you do not have a true understanding of consciousness, and you do not use consciousness within its proper fashion, what will happen is that you might become doomed to stay within lower states of consciousness. And when you stay within lower states of consciousness, then it is easier for you to miss the bigger picture. And when you miss the bigger picture, this is when people become nationalistic. This is when people fall into cults. This is what leads to very detrimental anti-societies like the KKK, Zionism, Nazi. And so when you begin to truly play with your consciousness, your spiritual fitness rises, because even in circumstances where you're tested, or in circumstances where you are a new individual entering into a foreign environment, you're able to battle against some of the forces that wish for you to stay restricted, oppressed, and suppressed. And this aids one in pushing back against some of the outer influences of society that wish to invert the order of values that would lead to the progression, evolution, and improvement of oneself. So when you begin to use consciousness in its truest sense, you begin to see we instead of me. You begin to give fully and sacrifice, not just for your best interest, but also for the best interests of others as well. And this is the main purpose behind us as human beings, is to give. But it's hard for one to give if they do not have the right context. Because why would you give if you don't have no understanding as to why you should give? And so consciousness helps you with this, because when you zoom in all the way into the inner aspects, the deepest, truest uniqueness of self. Then you zoom outward towards the body of self and the mind of self. Then you zoom outward to siblings and family. Then you zoom outward to community. Then you zoom outward to nation. Then you zoom outward to the human species. Then you zoom outward to the earth. Then you zoom outward to the cosmos. And then from there, it just goes infinitely. And so use consciousness to help you in understanding the bigger picture. And then your actions will begin to be predicated off of this. And so now when you're in the everyday world, instead of you falling into despair, you're able to see the nuances within even the most trivial of situations. And so you will be able to become the bigger person because you're able to see more than what is currently going on within a small set situation. This is what gives people calmness in times of immense struggle. And this will help you in increasing your ability within spiritual warfare when you begin to be lulled to sleep by mechanisms that seek to control and oppress you. And this even helps groups and communities who lack a overall highly developed spiritual fitness in seeing what oppresses and restricts them and controls them, and beginning to choose other options. Namely, right now in the modern world, the truest thing that is controlling, manipulating, and oppressing humans and their consciousness is technology. But not technology in and of itself, it's humans' inability to properly manage technology. And so we as humans, we have become addicted to technology in certain ways. And because of this, our consciousness is streamlined into what is going on within the social media worlds instead of with what's going on in the external environment. And because of this, we as humans have created this social awareness of categorizing people based off of what goes on online, even though the online sphere doesn't really exist. Because what happens online is just a snapshot of reality. It is what goes on in the digital world. And it might not be the truest definition of what is going on in the outer sphere. So use that awareness and shifting your consciousness, and it'll give you power over some of the other influences that is going on within our society. As we go into key number 2, understanding. What understanding will give you in increasing your spiritual fitness is it's not so much about morals, ethics, but more so about value. And in understanding, you're able to see how can you make the right decision within certain situations. So, for example, when you are dealing with technology, it isn't morally or ethically wrong whether you use technology or not use technology, but in the manner in which you do does speak volumes. So if you're using technology to demean, oppress, restrict, and control people unnecessarily, then you lack the understanding of the true purpose behind technology. Technology was created to connect humans with other humans and helping us to make difficult tasks more simpler, easier, and more convenient for us so that we can focus on other things. But when you lack understanding, this is when people begin to use devices for evil. And so just as religion can be used to promote good and the highest of values, is in the same way religion can be used in detrimental ways to form cults. So this is giving you the ability, this is what gives you a true third eye in seeing what is behind the curtain, and it helps you in making right decisions based off of right thought. So right action follows right thought, which follows the right spirit. So if you do not have the right spirit and the truest understanding of that, then you won't have the right thought. And if you do not have right thought, then you won't have right action. And so because everything starts and everything in essence is spiritual. And so if the spirit of one is of a low value and of a low order, then the actions streaming from the spiritual world to the physical world will streamline as such. So if you value ruthlessness, then in your heart, you will be a ruthless individual. And in your mind, you will see how you can cause people the most suffering, and you'll have a hard fist. And then in the outer world, you'll treat people with cold numbness, and you'll do things almost haphazardly. So let's say you'll become the boss that fires people and doesn't really think too much about it. Or you'll become the controlling and manipulative boyfriend that doesn't allow his girlfriend to do anything. Or you become the cult leader who doesn't allow people to express themselves or even to leave the establishment. So that's what happens when there's a wrong spirit within the individual and they lack true understanding. But when an individual has true understanding, then they place the highest value of orders within the deepest chambers of self. And then from that, they are able to express right thought and right action. As we go into key number 3, practice. The whole essence of practice is to give someone the ability to reconnect with their spiritual self. This is the overall purpose behind getting out in nature, doing mindfulness, doing meditation, doing reading and journaling. What these things will do is it will allow you to see what's going on, and it'll give you an internal lens on what are you thinking, what are you feeling, and what are you valuing. So once you are able to understand what it is going on inside at a specific moment, at a specific time, and then you're able to express that, then it'll give you the ability to change this consciously over time. So I love using this example is when you're in the car and you're driving and someone cuts you off, a lot of times the majority of humans will give in to the first passion that bubbles itself up to the surface. Now, there's nothing wrong with expression, frustration, irritation, and even anger. But when you're in those moments, what will happen when you do practice is that it gives you the ability to understand your internal state. And when you're able to understand your internal state at a higher level, then you'll have the ability to not only manage, but to control yourself. So this is what builds self-control and self-efficiency. So by doing practice, everything that happens, every single thought, action, and feeling is a form of religion. And so by building your spiritual fitness, you have the abilities, capabilities, and capacity to not only control in what manner, in what direction you're going in terms of their practice, but in exactly what it is that you're trying to work on and do. So I'm not going to go too deep into what exactly religion is, but the overall purpose of it is to reconnect you with your spiritual self. And so if you're not doing that from a lens of trying to reconnect with the spiritual self, then you might be practicing things wrong. And so practice could look like a bunch of things for you. If you're a Christian, you go to church, you follow the religion of Christianity. If you're a Buddhist, you follow the religion of Buddhism, Hinduism. But even from there, those are set doctrines with beliefs, principles, and ideals that people follow. And so if you have a belief system, a value system, principles, and set actions that you do repeatedly over a set duration of time, then you are practicing a form of religion. And so by having a practice, it helps you in determining what do you believe, what do you value, what is your ideal, what do you hold as the highest order of values. And when you do this consistently, then you will be able to shift those beliefs, those principles, and those values. Because a lot of times people within modern society, they don't know. A lot of times you're programmed. And this is what will shift you from becoming an conscious, actualized being versus being someone who simply be programmed. A conscious, actualized being chooses and has the free will to decide what they believe, what do they hold dear, and what are their convictions and their resolves. How do they see the outer world, and what is their worldview? They can consciously decide how they want to view that. But a programmed individual is told, is directed, and is shown. If you do not want to be controlled, directed, and shown, then you must engage in practice, which will then give you the ability to determine what do you believe, what do you value, what are your principles, and then from there you can decide and pick and choose which ones do you want to hold dear and dear. And so the problem with a lot of individuals staying as programmed individuals is because the programmed individual becomes a default to whatever the outer society values. And you can see this a lot of times with the modern individual, especially if the individual doesn't leave a particular location for long durations of time, then they become almost synergized to the local environment. So you can see this in a lot of rural areas, in rural parts of America. A lot of individuals think the same, they talk the same, they operate, function, and believe the same things. You can see this in the past with Nazi Germany. You can see this in the past with certain groups, Native Americans, colonial Americans. You can see this in ancient Egypt. You can see this. And so the problem with operating as a programmed individual is that when you're introduced to differing worldviews, belief systems, and principles, is that error formulates itself in the mind. And when error formulates itself in the mind and the mind begins to collapse, the individual will have two options: to accept the new, I'm using quotation marks, code or worldview, or to destroy whatever it is that is challenging the current worldview. So when an individual is programmed, it's more likely that they will stay connected with the ego, and the ego and pride and arrogance runs the show instead of self. So when you become a conscious, actualized being, self is what sits and directs, and because you are the one sitting and directing and maneuvering everything. But when you're programmed, the self gives up control to other beings that they believe to be of a higher position of authority, and those things is what directs. And then the ego surrounds the self to protect the self from any potential invaders that might challenge the other authorities. So you see this in a lot of cults. And so there'll be a spiritual leader who controls the congregation, and they will bestow upon them certain beliefs, and the congregation uplifts this quotational mark spiritual leader as having divine knowledge and divine insight given from whatever entity. And then the people formulate their egos around this belief system. And so when they interact with people outside of it, they're unable to connect with them because they're blocking themselves. So you want to be a conscious, actualized being. This will give you the ability to engage in the practice correctly of reconnecting to the spiritual self, which will give you understanding and the true meaning and purpose behind us human beings on earth. And then this will increase your overall consciousness and your ability to control and manage your consciousness so that you can see the bigger picture, stay calm with other people in very difficult situations. As we go into key number 4, remembrance. Because of the overstimulation of mind within modern society and the increasing indicator of dopamine that causes people to give into simple indulgences, it leaves people in a state where they are constantly in ignorance of their true self. And so this ignorance leads to individuals engaging in behavior to find and discover self because they don't remember the truest aspect of self. Guys, self has always been with you even before the day you were born to the present now, and it will be with you to the present future. Self isn't bestowed upon you. Self isn't given to you. Self isn't something that magically appears to you. Self is always with you. The only reason why you do not have self right now and you're not being self is because you have forgotten self. You have restricted, suppressed, and ignored self. But when you embrace self, then what will happen is that then you can be self. But you can never be self if you don't do all of the aforementioned actions. And so what remembrance also will give you is it will give you the remembrance of that which sustains self, the source of self. Some people call this God. Some people call this other things. You can call it what you want, but there is a soul source that is sustaining self because the same source sustains other selves, even outside of the domain and range of the human species. And so what you as a now developing conscious individual must do is you must constantly remember self. And the longer you can remember self and have states where you have remembrance of self is where you will increase your spiritual fitness of being a actualized conscious being. And then from there, you'll have self-autonomy and an increased free will. And so a lot of times, this is the purpose behind spiritual and religious practice. This is the overall purpose of understanding. And this is the overall purpose of having control over consciousness, because this will give you the ability of remembrance. Going into key number 5, last key for today's episode, giving. Spiritual fitness, you cannot receive if you do not give. And sometimes giving can be something as simple as acceptance and acknowledgement. You don't need anything to give. You can just give freely. So right now, I don't need anything to give this understanding to you guys. All I need is just to give, open my mouth and begin to speak words. But a lot of times within modern society, it has become a transactional, bartering society where individuals simply expect without giving. You must give first to receive. And so once you give first, then you'll receive. So this is the true essence of unconditional love. You don't need to attain something in order to give something first. You can just give with zero expectations or any inkling of whether or not you're going to get something in return. And I'm not going to lie, this is something very hard to do. This takes time for you to develop this practice. And I would take your time in doing this. And I wouldn't do this without planning it at first. And when you do it, it should be a very intimate moment where you do this and have a increased consciousness of what you're feeling while you're doing this. And a lot of times this will free a lot of people because a lot of times we hold on to things and we restrict ourselves because we're restricting out of a false belief that we're going to lose something. And this is the essence of neediness. People become needy because they believe that if they let go, then they'll lose something. But this is just a false premise. That is all the keys I have for you guys today for this week's episode of the Flow University YouTube channel. Use these keys to help you in building your spiritual fitness. I hope you all have enjoyed this week's episode and have a great rest of your day. Stay blessed.